A simple walk home turned into the beginning of an incredible story. A young black girl noticed an old man lying on the sidewalk. Without hesitation, she helped him to his feet. "Thank you, dear," he said with a trembling voice. She smiled and continued on her way, unaware that her life would change the next day. The next morning, she saw a notification from her bank. The amount in her account left her frozen in disbelief. What happened? Find out the rest of this amazing story. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the cracked pavement as Amara skipped down the familiar street, her well-worn sneakers slapping softly against the concrete. The rhythmic sound of her steps was the only thing breaking the silence of the otherwise quiet neighborhood. She was heading home from school, her backpack slung over one shoulder, slightly heavier than usual with the library books she had borrowed earlier that day. She had just rounded the corner when something caught her eye. A figure, crumpled and motionless, lay near the edge of the sidewalk, partially hidden by a lamppost. Her steps faltered, her heart quickening. At first, she thought it might be a bundle of clothes someone had left behind, but as she drew closer, she realized it was an elderly man. His thin frame was sprawled awkwardly, one arm stretched out toward a fallen cane that lay just out of reach. The man's gray hair clung to his damp forehead, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. His face was lined with both age and discomfort, and his suit, though once tidy, was now rumpled and stained with dirt. He looked utterly defeated. Amara stopped in her tracks, glancing around. The street was eerily empty, save for a few cars passing by, their drivers too preoccupied to notice the man. The windows of nearby houses were closed, curtains drawn. Even the convenience store a block away seemed devoid of its usual chatter. It was as if the world had turned a blind eye to the scene unfolding before her. Her first instinct was to look away, to keep walking. She was just a child, what could she possibly do? Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, "Stay safe, Amara. The world isn't always kind." But another voice, quieter yet more persistent, whispered something different, "Do the right thing, even when it's hard." Swallowing her fear, Amara approached the man cautiously. "Mister," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you okay?" The man stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. His gaze met hers, and for a moment, confusion clouded his tired eyes. Then recognition flickered. "Help!" he croaked, his voice barely audible. "Please!" Amara didn't hesitate. She knelt beside him, her small hands reaching for his outstretched arm. "I'm here," she said softly. "Let's get you up." The man winced as she gently helped him sit upright. His breathing was labored, but he managed a faint, grateful smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling as much as his body. "Can you stand?" Amara asked, her brow furrowed with concern. She glanced around again, hoping someone else might appear to help, but the street remained empty. He nodded weakly. "I think so." Using all her strength, Amara helped him to his feet, the effort making her shoulders ache. Once standing, the man leaned heavily on her for support. She reached down to retrieve his cane, pressing it into his hand. "Here," she said, steadying him as best she could. For a moment, they stood together in silence. The man's weight eased as he adjusted to the cane, his posture straightening slightly. "You're a kind soul," he said, his voice still faint but filled with sincerity. Not many would have stopped. Amara felt her cheeks flush. She didn't know what to say, so she simply smiled. "You're welcome," she murmured. The man's eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as though he wanted to say more. But instead, he gave her a small nod and began to shuffle away, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. Amara watched him go until he disappeared around the corner, the sound of his steps fading into the distance. As she continued her walk home, a strange sense of warmth settled in her chest. She didn't know who the man was or what had brought him to that place, but she felt certain she had done the right thing. Little did she know, this single act of kindness was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. As the elderly man steadied himself on his cane, his frail frame still trembling from the effort, he turned to face Amara. His eyes, lined with years of wear and hardship, glistened with unshed tears. For a moment, he simply looked at her, as if searching for the right words to say. "You didn't have to stop," he said finally, his voice low and trembling but filled with an unmistakable sincerity. "Most people wouldn't." Amara shifted uncomfortably, not used to being the center of attention. "It was nothing," she mumbled, glancing down at her scuffed sneakers. But deep down, she felt the weight of his words, the truth in them. She had seen the cars pass by, the curtains twitch as neighbors peeked out but did nothing. She had seen the world look away. The man shook his head slowly. "It wasn't nothing," he said, his voice growing steadier. "It was everything." His words caught her off guard, and she looked up, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes, a depth, a history, that she couldn't quite place. For the first time, she noticed how tired he looked, not just physically but in a way that seemed to go deeper, as though he had been carrying the weight of the world for far too long. "I don't know your name," he continued, his grip tightening slightly on the handle of his cane, "but I want you to know that you've made a difference today. A bigger difference than you realize." Amara didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to such direct, heartfelt gratitude. "I'm just glad you're okay," she said softly, her words simple but genuine. The man's lips curved into a faint smile. "Kindness like yours is rare, especially these days. I won't forget it. I promise you that." His voice, though still shaky, carried a quiet strength that made Amara believe him. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a strange but comforting sensation, as though the world had momentarily tilted in her favor. For a girl who often felt overlooked, dismissed, or out of place, this moment was something she hadn't known she needed. The man straightened slightly, his grip on the cane firming as he took a cautious step forward. He hesitated, turning back to look at her one last time. "You've given me more than you know," he said. "And one day, I hope I can repay that." Amara blinked, startled by the weight of his words. Before she could ask what he meant, he nodded gently and continued on his way. His figure grew smaller with each step, but his words lingered, echoing in her mind. As she walked the rest of the way home, the city around her seemed quieter, the air lighter. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she knew it was important. She had done something meaningful, and for the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not for her struggles, but for her kindness. And though she couldn't yet grasp the magnitude of what was to come, she couldn't shake the sense that this encounter was just the beginning of something extraordinary. Amara pushed open the creaky front door of their small apartment, the familiar scent of fried plantains and a hint of lavender detergent greeting her. The living room was modest, with a second-hand sofa covered by a colorful throw, its edges fraying slightly. Her younger brother, Malik, was sprawled on the floor, meticulously arranging his collection of toy cars into neat rows, while their mother, a tired but strong woman with warm eyes, stood at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables. "You're late," her mother said without looking up, her hands deftly working the knife. "Did something happen?" Amara hesitated for a moment, kicking off her shoes and placing her backpack on the worn chair by the door. "Nothing bad," she said, walking into the kitchen and leaning against the counter. "I helped someone." Her mother's hands paused mid-chop. She turned her head slightly, her curiosity piqued. "Helped someone? What do you mean?" Amara took a deep breath, recounting the story of the elderly man she had seen on the sidewalk. She described how no one else had stopped, how frail he had looked, and how she had helped him to his feet. As she spoke, her mother put down the knife and leaned against the counter, her expression softening with pride. "That was a good thing you did, Amara," her mother said, reaching out to brush a stray curl from her daughter's face. "Kindness doesn't cost anything, but it can mean everything to someone else." Amara felt a warm flush of pride at her mother's words, but it was quickly tempered by the seriousness that crept into her mother's expression. "But," her mother continued, her voice lowering, "You have to be careful, especially in this world. Not everyone has good intentions. Not everyone will see your kindness for what it is." Amara frowned. "What do you mean?" Her mother sighed and pulled out a chair, motioning for Amara to sit down beside her. "The world isn't always fair, especially for people like us," she said gently. "There are people who might take advantage of your kindness, or worse, judge you just because of the color of your skin." Amara's chest tightened. She had heard these warnings before, the stories her mother shared about the subtle and not so subtle injustices she had faced growing up. But hearing them now, after what had felt like such a pure and meaningful moment, made her feel a pang of sadness. "So, I shouldn't have helped him?" Amara asked quietly, her eyes searching her mother's face. Her mother's expression softened, and she placed a hand on Amara's shoulder. "No, sweetheart, that's not what I'm saying. What you did was right, and it shows the kind of person you are, a person with a good heart. Just promise me that you'll always be aware of your surroundings, and trust your instincts. The world needs people like you, but it's not always kind to people like us." Amara nodded slowly, her mother's words settling in her chest like a mix of comfort and caution. She wanted to believe that kindness could triumph over cruelty, but her mother's warnings reminded her that the world was more complicated than she sometimes wished it to be. That night, as Amara sat at the dinner table with her family, the sounds of Malik's excited chatter about his toy cars filling the room, she thought about the man she had helped. His gratitude, his frailty, the promise in his voice. She couldn't shake the feeling that their brief encounter had been significant, even if she didn't yet know why. As the evening wound down and she climbed into bed, Amara stared at the ceiling, her mother's words echoing in her mind. She hoped the man was okay, that her small act of kindness had made a difference. Little did she know, the events of the next day would show her just how much. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains of Amara's small bedroom, casting soft patterns on the walls. She stirred under the warm quilt, the distant hum of the city filtering in through the window. The room was quiet except for the occasional chirping of birds and the faint sound of Malik playing with his toy cars in the living room. Amara blinked herself awake and reached for her old phone on the nightstand, its cracked screen lighting up with a familiar ding. She squinted at the notification, her mind still groggy. It was from her bank, a standard balance update that usually brought little more than a resigned sigh. But this time, her breath caught in her throat. The number displayed on the screen was so large it didn't seem real. She sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. She refreshed the app twice, certain it had to be some kind of mistake. But the number didn't change. Her usual balance, which rarely crept above a few dollars, now showed an amount that could only be described as life-changing. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the phone, her mind racing. Who could have sent her this money? Why? The memory of the elderly man from the day before flashed through her mind. Could it be him? Amara. Breakfast, her mother's voice called from the kitchen, pulling her out of her thoughts. She scrambled out of bed, her bare feet padding against the cool floor as she rushed into the living room, still clutching the phone. Her mother stood at the stove, flipping pancakes on their slightly worn skillet, while Malik sat at the table, humming to himself as he lined up his toy cars. Amara's father, who had just come off a long night shift, sat sipping coffee with a tired but contented look on his face. "Mom!" Amara blurted, holding up her phone. "You won't believe this." Her mother turned, raising an eyebrow at Amara's urgency. "What is it, sweetheart?" Amara held out the phone, the screen glowing with the bank notification. Her mother wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and leaned in, squinting at the screen. Her expression shifted from mild curiosity to wide-eyed shock. "Amara," she whispered, her voice trailing off as she grabbed her husband's arm. "Look at this." Her father took the phone, his brows furrowing as he stared at the screen. "Is this some kind of scam?" he asked, his voice skeptical but tinged with astonishment. "Did you give out your account information to anyone?" "No!" Amara shook her head vehemently. "I don't even know how this happened. The only thing I can think of is the man I helped yesterday." The one who fell. Her parents exchanged glances, a mix of disbelief and concern flashing across their faces. Malik, sensing the shift in the room, abandoned his toy cars and padded over, peering up at them with wide eyes. "You think he sent this?" her mother asked, her tone cautious. "Why would he?" "That's an incredible amount of money, Amara." "I don't know," Amara admitted, her voice quieter now. "But he said I made a difference. He promised he wouldn't forget." Her father set the phone down, rubbing his temple. "We need to be careful," he said firmly. "This could be a mistake, or worse, something that could get us into trouble. We should call the bank and figure out where it came from." Her mother nodded, but her gaze lingered on Amara, softening slightly. "It's unbelievable," she said quietly. "But if it's real, maybe this is his way of saying thank you." Amara's heart swelled with a mix of excitement and nervousness. She wanted to believe the money was a genuine gift, a reward for her small act of kindness. But the uncertainty gnawed at her. What if her father was right? What if it was all too good to be true? As her family gathered around the table, the pancakes forgotten, they began to discuss their next steps. The air was thick with a mix of hope and apprehension, each of them acutely aware of how much this money could change their lives. For Amara, it was more than just the money. It was the idea that a single moment of kindness could ripple outward in ways she had never imagined. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The family sat around the small dining table, their breakfast of pancakes now cold and forgotten. Amara's father had called the bank earlier that morning to confirm the source of the mysterious deposit. The representative, after a brief hold, had returned with an answer that left them all in stunned silence. The money had come from an account linked to a name none of them recognized, Arthur Montgomery, Arthur Montgomery, her mother repeated, her voice tinged with confusion. "I've never heard of him." Amara's heart raced as the name stirred something in her memory. "Wait," she said, sitting up straighter. "I think that's the man I helped yesterday." Her father leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed deeply. "Are you sure, Amara?" She nodded. "He never said his name, but I remember how he looked. Frail, wearing an old suit. It has to be him." Her mother disappeared into the living room and returned moments later with their aging laptop. Setting it on the table, she opened the search engine and typed in the name. The screen filled with results almost instantly, and at the top was a photo that made Amara's breath catch. "That's him," she said, pointing at the screen. "That's the man I helped." The article accompanying the photo was from a business journal, and its headline read, "Arthur Montgomery, the reclusive philanthropist who gives without asking." Below it was a detailed story chronicling the life of a once-renowned real estate mogul who had amassed a fortune in his younger years. In recent decades, however, Montgomery had retreated from the public eye, dedicating his wealth to anonymous acts of charity. Her mother scrolled through the article, her eyes widening with every paragraph. "It says here he's donated millions to hospitals, schools, and shelters across the city," she murmured. "But he's always stayed out of the spotlight. Hardly anyone knows what he looks like." "That explains why we didn't recognize him," her father said, his tone thoughtful. "He's not just rich. He's unique." Amara stared at the screen, her mind racing. She thought back to the previous day, the way the man had thanked her, the promise in his voice that he wouldn't forget her kindness. At the time, she hadn't understood the weight of his words. Now, it all made sense. "He must have meant this," she said softly, gesturing to the bank notification still open on her phone. "The money, it's his way of saying thank you." Her mother placed a hand on Amara's shoulder, her expression a mix of pride and amazement. "You've touched someone's life in a way most people never will, Amara," she said. "This isn't just about money. It's about what your kindness meant to him." Amara's father nodded, though his practical side still tempered his excitement. "We need to handle this carefully," he said. "Money like this can change things, but it can also bring challenges. We should reach out to him, thank him properly, and make sure there are no misunderstandings. The more the family read about Arthur Montgomery, the more curious they became. His story was both inspiring and enigmatic, a man who had every reason to bask in his success but instead chose a path of quiet generosity. Amara couldn't help but wonder what had led him to that street corner the day before. Was it coincidence, or had their paths crossed for a reason? And what was it about her simple act of kindness that had compelled him to respond with such a grand gesture? As the day went on, the mystery of Arthur Montgomery lingered in the air. Amara felt a strange mix of humility and wonder. She had only done what felt right in the moment, but somehow it had set off a chain of events that now seemed almost surreal. That evening, as the family sat together in their cozy living room, Amara reflected on the man's parting words, "You've given me more than you know." At the time, she hadn't understood their full meaning. But now, as she thought about the quiet, unassuming man who had dedicated his life to helping others, she realized his words weren't just about her act of kindness, they were about the world he believed in, a world where small gestures could lead to extraordinary outcomes. And for the first time, she began to believe in that world too. Amara's world had always felt a size too small, like a room where the walls seemed to edge closer every time she tried to breathe freely. At school, the stares came first, curious, then mocking. Her classmates whispered behind her back, their words sharp enough to slice through her confidence. "Why's her hair like that?" one girl had said in a voice loud enough for Amara to hear. "It looks like a mop." "She's so dark," another boy had chimed in, as if her skin tone was something to be analyzed, a curiosity rather than a fact of life. The teasing grew crueler as the years went on. They called her names that stung, nicknames that echoed in her mind long after the school bell rang. They avoided her in group projects, leaving her to work alone while they laughed among themselves. Lunchtimes were the worst. She often sat by herself, poking at her food and pretending not to notice the empty seats around her. On the playground, the cruelty shifted from words to actions. She remembered a day when a ball had rolled toward her. She'd picked it up, eager to join the game, only for a group of kids to snatch it away with sneers. "We don't need your help," one of them had said, his tone dismissive. It wasn't the first time she had been reminded, in ways big and small, that they didn't see her as one of them. Even outside of school, the world didn't seem much kinder. On the streets of their neighborhood, people sometimes cast cold, judgmental glances at her and her mother. The whispers were quieter here, but the meaning behind them was the same. Amara had overheard a stranger once mutter, "Kids like her never go far," as she passed by. She hadn't understood what they meant at the time, but the tone was unmistakably dismissive, heavy with prejudice. Her mother often shielded her from the worst of it. When someone made a cutting remark, her mother would hold her hand tightly and quicken their pace, whispering, "Don't listen, baby. You're better than that." But the words lingered, carving small scars into Amara's young heart. At home, Amara found moments of solace. Their apartment was small but filled with warmth, her mother's laughter making up for its lack of space. On the hardest days, when the weight of the world felt unbearable, her mother would sit her down on the worn sofa, pulling her close. "You're strong, Amara," she'd say, brushing her fingers through her daughter's hair. "Stronger than anyone who tries to tear you down. Don't let their words decide who you are." Amara would nod, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. For a little while, she would believe those words. But when she was alone, the doubts crept back in. How could she not be affected when the world seemed intent on reminding her she didn't belong? Despite everything, Amara had always clung to the belief that kindness mattered. Her mother's lessons, though often tested, had taken root deep in her heart. She had learned to look for the good in people, even when it seemed hidden behind layers of cruelty or indifference. The day she saw the old man lying on the sidewalk, her first thought hadn't been about herself or her safety. It had been about him, about the pain etched into his features and the loneliness in his eyes. She couldn't ignore it, no matter how much the world had ignored her. Her act of kindness that day wasn't just a momentary decision, it was a reflection of who she truly was. She had every reason to be bitter, to walk past without looking back, but that wasn't who Amara wanted to be. She wanted to believe that kindness could rise above cruelty, even when her own life often told her otherwise. As she sat in her room later that evening, thinking about the man she had helped and the gratitude in his voice, Amara felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as small or as cold as it seemed. Maybe her mother was right, kindness didn't cost anything, but it could mean everything. And though she didn't yet know what the future held, Amara decided then and there that she would always choose to be the person who stopped, the person who cared, no matter how the world treated her. It was a decision that would soon change her life in ways she could never have imagined. The first letter arrived on a breezy Thursday morning, tucked neatly into a white envelope and addressed simply to Amara and family. Her mother found it in their mailbox, nestled among the usual bills and advertisements. Unlike the others, this envelope was handwritten, the elegant script giving it an air of warmth and sincerity. At breakfast, they gathered around the table as her mother carefully opened the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper, folded with care. She began to read aloud, her voice soft and filled with wonder. Dear Amara, I heard about your kindness and the incredible story that followed. Your act of helping someone in need has touched more hearts than you can imagine. The world needs more people like you, people who remind us that a simple gesture can create ripples of change. Never forget the power of your goodness. With admiration, Margaret L. Amara sat frozen, her fork hovering above her plate. They wrote to me, she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. Her father nodded, smiling. They did. And I don't think this will be the last. Within days, more letters began arriving, each one bringing words of encouragement, gratitude, and admiration. They came from strangers across the city, the state, and even places Amara had only seen on maps. Some envelopes were bright and colorful, decorated with stickers and doodles. Others were simple, containing neatly typed messages. But all of them carried the same heartfelt sentiment: her kindness mattered, and it had inspired others. One letter, written in shaky but determined handwriting, came from an elderly woman named Edith. Amara, it began, your story reminded me of my late husband, who always believed in helping others. He would have loved to know that someone as young as you carries that same spirit. Never let the world harden your heart. Another, from a teacher in another state, said, I shared your story with my students, and we spent the entire day talking about the importance of helping others. You've inspired a classroom full of children to believe in the power of kindness. Soon, the letters weren't the only things arriving. Small packages began to show up on their doorstep, books about courage, art supplies with notes encouraging her to dream big, and even a hand-knit scarf from a woman who wrote, I made this to keep you warm, just like your kindness warms so many hearts. One day, a box arrived containing a scrapbook, its pages filled with handwritten notes and drawings from children at a local elementary school. On the first page, in large, colorful letters, it read, Thank you, Amara, for teaching us to be brave. As she flipped through the pages, Amara felt tears welling in her eyes. Each message, each picture, was a reminder that her small act of kindness had reached further than she could have ever imagined. The flood of support didn't just uplift Amara, it brought a renewed sense of hope and connection to her entire family. Her mother began placing the letters in a shoebox, which quickly grew too small to contain them all. Eventually, they started pinning some of the most touching messages on the wall in the living room, creating a collage of gratitude and inspiration. Her father, who had always been cautious and reserved, found himself smiling more often. He would sit with Amara in the evenings, reading the letters aloud and marveling at the kindness of strangers. This, he said one night, holding up a letter from a retired firefighter, is proof that the world isn't all bad. People still care. Amara's story began to spark something larger than she had anticipated. Local organizations reached out, offering scholarships and inviting her to speak at events about the importance of compassion. One day, her school principal called her into his office to show her a bulletin board filled with letters from her classmates, many of whom had written apologies for the way they had treated her in the past. It took courage to do what you did, one letter read. I hope we can all learn to be as brave and kind as you." As the days turned into weeks, Amara realized that her act of kindness had become more than just a story, it had become a movement. People from all walks of life were reminded of the power of a small, selfless act. They weren't just inspired by her, they were inspired to act themselves. Late one evening, as she sat on the floor of her room surrounded by letters, Amara thought back to the moment she had helped the old man. At the time, it had seemed like such a small thing. But now, looking at the hundreds of messages of love and gratitude, she understood that kindness wasn't small, it was boundless. And for the first time, she truly believed in the ripples her actions had created. What had started as a single act had grown into a wave of goodness, proving that even the smallest gestures could change the world. The day was calm, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow through the sheer curtains of the living room. Amara sat on the floor with her brother Malik, helping him line up his toy cars and an intricate racetrack they had created. Her parents were in the kitchen, their hushed voices discussing dinner plans. The house buzzed with a quiet, comfortable energy, the kind that comes when life begins to settle after weeks of excitement and upheaval. Then came the knock at the door. Amara's father glanced at the clock. It was too early for the neighbors to drop by, and they weren't expecting anyone. He exchanged a curious look with his wife before walking to the door and opening it. Standing on the doorstep, leaning slightly on his cane but holding himself with a quiet dignity, was the old man. Arthur Montgomery. His weathered face broke into a small, warm smile as he met Amara's father's eyes. "Good afternoon," Arthur said, his voice as steady as it was kind. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to thank your family in person, especially your daughter." Amara's father blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but quickly recovered. "Of course," he said, stepping aside. "Please, come in." Arthur entered, his steps careful but purposeful. Amara's mother appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, her expression a mix of curiosity and recognition. Malik, sensing the importance of the moment, scooted closer to Amara, who had risen to her feet, her wide eyes fixed on the man she had helped just weeks earlier. "Amara," Arthur said, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "It's good to see you again." "You remember me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Arthur chuckled lightly, the sound warm and genuine. "How could I forget? You stopped when no one else did. You gave me a kindness I didn't even know I needed." They invited him to sit on the couch, and he lowered himself carefully onto the cushion, leaning his cane against the armrest. Amara's parents sat nearby, their faces attentive, while she perched on the edge of a chair, her heart beating faster with every moment. Arthur began to speak, his voice steady but carrying the weight of years lived. He told them about his life, a story that seemed both extraordinary and deeply human. He had been a businessman, building a fortune in real estate during his younger years. For decades, he had been consumed by his work, driven by ambition and the pursuit of success. But in his later years, he had begun to see the cost of that success. "I realized," he said, his eyes distant, "that I had spent so much time building walls around myself that I'd forgotten how to reach out to others. I had wealth, but no connection. No one to share it with." He paused, his gaze turning to Amara. "And then, one day, I stumbled. Quite literally." His smile returned, soft but genuine. "And there you were. A stranger, a child, who could have walked away like everyone else. But you didn't. You stopped. You helped. And in that moment, I was reminded of something I'd lost sight of, that even the smallest gestures can mean everything." Amara listened intently, her chest swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. Her parents exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting both awe and gratitude. "Your act of kindness," Arthur continued, his voice steady, "reminded me of the person I wanted to be, the person I still have time to become. That's why I chose to thank you the way I did. It wasn't just about the money, it was about honoring the kindness that still exists in this world and making sure it has the chance to grow." Amara's mother wiped a tear from the corner of her eye, her voice soft but steady. "You didn't have to do what you did, Mr. Montgomery. But we're grateful beyond words." Arthur shook his head gently. "The gratitude is mine. Meeting Amara reminded me of the power of simple goodness, and I wanted to make sure your family had the opportunity to nurture that." Before leaving, Arthur reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to Amara. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing the crisp paper. "This," he said, his voice filled with quiet emotion, "isn't about money. It's about potential. Inside, you'll find the contact information for people who can help guide you, mentors, educators, people who believe in what kindness can do. Use it wisely, and never stop believing in the good you carry." Amara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she nodded, her eyes shimmering with tears. As Arthur stood to leave, Amara surprised herself, and everyone else, by stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. For a moment, he seemed startled, but then his cane clattered to the floor as he returned the embrace, his voice soft as he said, "Thank you, Amara." When he finally stepped out into the fading sunlight, the room felt different, warmer, fuller. Amara clutched the envelope in her hands, feeling its weight not in paper, but in meaning. Her parents pulled her close, Malik joining in the group hug. In that moment, the world seemed just a little brighter, proof that kindness, no matter how small, could ripple outwards in ways they had only begun to understand. The morning light spilled into the small apartment, brighter than ever before. For the first time in years, it felt like the sun was shining just for them. Amara sat at the kitchen table, a notebook spread before her, the pages filled with her sketches and ideas for the future. Her mother was humming softly as she prepared breakfast, her steps lighter, her smile brighter. Malik raced through the living room, waving a toy airplane in the air, his laughter echoing through the walls. Everything felt different now, not just because of the money, but because of what it represented: hope, opportunity, and a fresh start. Amara's father had found a part-time job that allowed him to spend more evenings at home. Their conversations at the dinner table had shifted from worries about bills to dreams of the future. Her mother had even started taking a class in business management, inspired by Arthur Montgomery's story and her own newfound determination. For Amara, life was blossoming in ways she had only imagined. She had begun attending her new school, a place that felt welcoming from the very first day. Her teachers encouraged her creativity, her classmates included her in their games, and for the first time, she felt like she truly belonged. Word of their journey spread beyond their small neighborhood. Journalists reached out, eager to tell the story of a little girl whose single act of kindness had rippled outward, changing not just her life, but inspiring an entire community. Amara's family hesitated at first, unsure if they wanted to share something so personal. But then her mother said, "Maybe our story will remind others that kindness matters. That it has the power to create change." Their story was published in magazines, newspapers, and even shared on television. Messages poured in from people around the world, teachers who read Amara's story to their students, families who found hope in their journey, and even strangers who had been inspired to help those around them. The walls of their small living room were now adorned with letters and cards sent from strangers, expressions of gratitude, admiration, and love. Amara often sat beneath them, reading through the words, feeling the connection to people she would never meet but whose lives had been touched by her simple act. One evening, as she sat sketching in her notebook, her father peeked over her shoulder. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to a drawing of a small building with bright, welcoming windows. "It's a community center," Amara said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "A place where kids like me can feel safe and welcome. Where no one feels alone." Her father smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You've got big dreams, kid," he said. "And I believe you can make them happen." The family continued to grow, not just in financial stability but in their connection to each other and the world around them. They started volunteering at local shelters and organizing events at Amara's school, teaching others that even the smallest gestures could create the biggest changes. Amara's journey was no longer just about her or her family, it had become a beacon for others, a living testament to the power of kindness. As she stood in front of her class one day, sharing her story during a school assembly, she looked out at the sea of faces and saw hope reflected back at her. Amara's story is a reminder that small acts of kindness can have unimaginable ripple effects. Her journey shows us that change begins with a single step, a single decision to care. If her story has inspired you, imagine what you could do in your own life. What do you think about Amara's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, kindness, and inspiration. Together, we can make the world a better place, one act of kindness at a time.